The man dropped past the docking ramp so fast that no one else noticed except Tonkal, who was looking in that direction. Tonkal never realized if the man was already dead or if the wind had simply carried his scream away. But it happened without a sound. The weather was perfect for setting sail from the tower. But from the perspective of the people on the ramp, there was nothing marvelous about it. A strong, cold wind, every gust of which pelted the tower, and the people on the platform with walls of prickly rain instantly blew away any sounds. Tonkal had been expecting something like this. Tension among the tower's population had been rising for weeks, and despite the administration's attempts to defuse the situation, people only grew increasingly grim and determined. The last straw was the sudden breakdown of the reactor that supplied power to several dozen levels. Tonkal knew some of the reactor's staff, and he knew that the failure was real. However, rumors had immediately spread through the de-energized levels that the administration had deliberately shut down the reactor to subdue the people. Tonkal glanced around at the bustle on the dock ramp. The loading was almost complete. Several sailors were hooking the last 2 pallets of supplies and energy cells to the cargo winches while the bosun and 3 watchmen stood with their backs to the ship, keeping a close eye on the open ramp gate. They didn't exactly have the entrance to the tower in their sights, but the automatic rifles in their hands had their safeties set on full auto. He remembered his argument with Fotalo, the owner of the other ship. The old sailor had argued that all the radicals had gone to the North Tower after the revolution there, and that the South Tower would be peaceful now, so there was no need to provoke the population with the appearance of armed guards. Many people already think the krill fishermen are too privileged, Fotalo said then. His wrinkled brown face was almost devoid of facial expressions, as if decades of ocean winds and rain had driven all his emotions deep into those wrinkles. You know the government ordered the requisitioning of guns from everyone but us. Some took it as a personal insult. Tonkal grinned, shaking his head. First, you say there's nothing to fear because all the radicals have fled. And right after that, you ask us not to provoke the mob. I think you got it all wrong, foe. Besides, what's it to you? You're leaving tomorrow. I still need at least a week to load up and repair the rigging. So, I'll go for safety. I think the fear of the gun will counterbalance the irritation of looking at it. That was 8 days ago. Fotalo did not respond to Tonkal's arguments, but his ship left the tower the same evening, a good half day before Fotalo had initially planned. Tonkal's crew had already finished all their planned work that day. Those still on deck, enjoying the last rays of the setting sun that colored the clouds and ocean in all shades of scarlet and gold, raised their hands in the traditional salute of the air krill fishermen. The crew from Fotalo's ship waved back. Tonkal didn't know it yet, but that was the last time he would see Fotalo and his crew. 2 days later, the government declared a state of emergency due to the reactor failure, and the population of South Tower began to slowly boil over, like water in a tightly sealed pot. It was a good thing that he had brought all the supplies and materials he needed to the docking area as soon as he returned to the tower a month ago, and now he could work and load without having to send people to the other levels. But armed guards now were on watch beside the ship 24 hours a day. Every now and then, one of the dock staff would bring news from the tower. Squinting at the stern men with rifles in their hands, they told Tonkal that the center of discontent had shifted from the lower levels to the upper ones, where power shortages had shut down many of the workshops. That the hydroponic plantations were under threat too. That the roadblocks on the bridge between the towers might, if anything, refuse to do their job of protecting the South Tower and let the radicals through. And most importantly, the most incredible and strange, that the members of the so-called contact group, Tonkal still hadn't decided whether to consider them cranks, crazy speculators or just cunning crooks, claimed that they had almost succeeded in deciphering the messages they were supposedly receiving from deep space. The whole thing made Tonkal want to get away before the entire tower became one colossal battlefield, or worse, a madhouse. Tonkal looked out beyond the ramp and the ship to where the North Tower loomed behind the rain and the roar of the wind. Some 15 years ago, it would have shone with lights, like a huge gleaming embodiment of human perseverance and confidence. But now, only a few faint sparks struggled to shine through the storm. They say the radicals there have declared a republic of free men. Tonkal shook his head. He didn't understand why this new republic had to be based on the destruction of the tower's entire infrastructure. Would a working toilet and kitchen stove really enslave a person that much? And now, apparently, the violence has also spilled over into the South Tower. The picture of a human body hurtling past the ramp still stood before Tonkal's eyes. Was it an accident? A single murder? Or a sign of a larger disturbance beginning? Tonkal was sure he didn't want to find out. A ragged chorus of cheers erupted from the ship, barely breaking through the stormy wind and rain noise. Tonkal turned around. The last pallet of energy cells was aboard, and the sailors were already climbing aboard the ship. The rifle-wielding watchmen still stood watching the dock gate, but Tonkal noticed that they too were already looking obliquely toward the gangway and at their captain, as if silently asking, "Well, isn't it time to get the hell out of this place?" He knew it was. In 15 minutes, Cloud Warrior departed from the tower, at the same time being brought to the wind. "No contact with the control room," said Tonkal's chief mate, Chimest. He was sitting in a chair at the communications console, flicking switches. All channels are dead silent. He pressed the last button and leaned back against the creaking high backrest. At first, I thought there was something on the comm, like someone shrieking or something. But from that moment on, total silence. Looks like they knocked out the central communicator. Tonkal looked through the transparent ceiling of the control room at the panoramic windows of the South Tower's main control room. The entire tower was slowly shrinking in size as the Cloud Warrior gained speed, but the enormous man-made structure still obscured nearly the entire sky. A huge angular column glittering with many lights that shone even through the heavy rain. Despite the shutdown of the main reactor, there was enough auxiliary power for minor needs like lighting. To the far right, its almost dead twin, the North Tower, was vaguely visible in the darkness. The control room was a dozen levels above the docks from which Tonkal's ship had departed. The only thing visible through the streams of rainwater running down the roof of the ship's bridge was a glowing, oblong rectangular spot where the windows supposedly were. "Maybe they're all drunk and asleep," Tonkal said. "I wouldn't be surprised by now, frankly. Things have been going downhill for the last couple of years. And ever since this strange sect started preaching, the insiders have gone completely off the rails." The Insiders was the nickname that the airship crews gave to the inhabitants of the towers, those who never left the huge termite mound of metal and plastic. Funny, Tonkal thought. No one had seen a real termite for generations, not since the gray swimmers finally closed off human access to the forbidden continent. But the expression remained. A long time ago, he found an article about termites in the database, and these tireless builders even seemed sympathetic to him in their own way, though not in appearance, of course. But Tonkal was sure that most towers and airmen, while still calling the towers the mounds, had no idea what the term meant. "It could be," Chimest said doubtfully. "But I talked to the senior officer on duty less than an hour ago, and it didn't seem like they were having a party or anything." He took the headphones off his head and threw them on the console. What difference does it make now anyway? Why should we care if they didn't need an official departure message? Tonkal was feeling the same way. All right, he said, turning away from the tower, which shimmered behind a wall of rain. We'll try to contact them later. Maybe they're having power problems there too. Shit! The last exclamation came out at the same time as a white-orange flash, bright enough to blind even through the rain sprays. It instantly swelled exactly where the rectangle of control room windows had just glowed. Before Tonkal, Chimest, and the few other crewmen on the Cloud Warrior's bridge could realize anything, the blast wave caught up with the ship and slammed its stern, hurling it far forward and down towards the night ocean, invisible in the darkness. By noon, emergency crews had finished inspecting and repairing all the damage. It wasn't as bad as Tonkal had feared. After all, the Cloud Warrior had been designed to withstand the mighty storms and squalls that sometimes swooped in from the south over the ocean expanses far from the forbidden continent. The blast wave tore some rigging and damaged some fishing equipment. Nothing the crew couldn't fix on their own. Tonkal had no idea what was happening in the tower, but it was clearly something terrible. A week ago, when they'd made the final decision on the departure date, he'd allowed all the married members of the crew to bring their loved ones aboard. And now, he'd been catching appreciative glances from those people every now and then. Of course, most airmen were lonely vagabonds like Tonkal himself, but that didn't mean they didn't respect the family connections of their friends. The Cloud Warrior was a spacious ship. It had been built about 2 centuries ago, when swarms of air krill were huge living rivers that lined the sky from horizon to horizon, and it was designed to go autonomous for months of active fishing. Much has changed since then. The gray swimmers had consistently reduced the krill's extraction quotas and migration range, and the need for such large ships had long since died. Most modern ships were much smaller. The Cloud Warrior was the last of the large skyboats. It was for their luck, as there was plenty of room for extra people. Tonkal stepped out onto the open area on the bridge wing and leaned on the leer, admiring the vast mirror of the ocean. It was a fine day, cloudless and warm, though Tonkal could have used a fresher breeze. By morning, they were out of the storm zone, and their speed had slowed considerably, but the towers were already below the horizon, though the ship was almost a kilometer above the water surface. There's still no communication with the towers. Tonkal turned around. Chimest was standing behind him, rubbing his forehead tiredly. The communicator in the control room isn't the only one in the tower, Tonkal said. Have you tried calling other stations? Chimest shook his head. Silence. No one's answering. Something's happened over there. You know, at first I was glad we got away, but now I'm wondering if we'll have a place to go back to. Tonkal sighed. He had expected this kind of talk, and it was good that Chimest had been the first to start it. They were friends for years, and if they could talk things over in private first, the easier it would be to explain it to the crew. I wish I knew, Chim, but think of everyone on board. Families, wives, kids. Think of the explosion. Would you want them to stay there? And one more thing. He quickly told Chimest about the man who fell from the tower. No matter how this ends, we'd better stay away from Neptune Towers for the near future. Yeah. Chimest shook his head again. These are bad times. Very bad. Don't get discouraged, Chim. Tonkal clapped his friend on the shoulder. We've seen some bad things in our time. We'll get through this. I'd like to believe it, but... Chimest stared blankly into the distance, where the liquid gold of the ocean merged with the sky. Things have been getting worse and worse for the last 10 years. The riots, the radicals, the cultists, the rebellion in the North Tower. There's been no communication with the other towers for years, Now something's happened back home." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't help feeling that our time here is ending." "We've got a few months' supply, Chim," Tonkel said, in as cheerful a tone as possible. "Then we'll come back and check what's going on. Maybe things will settle down by then." "I don't mean us. I mean, not just our ship. I'm talking about humanity in general. We used to own the world, Ton. And now, we're crammed into a few dozen goddamn towers and can't even look at the land that was once our home. The gray swimmers decide everything for us. And yet the damn things don't even dignify us with a direct conversation. They just show us what we can and can't do. It's like we're their tame pets." When Chimist mentioned the gray swimmers, Tonkel looked at the ocean, but nowhere did he see the characteristic ripples that indicated the presence of vast swarms of gray swimmers, the actual rulers of the planet once named Earth. The most paradoxical thing was that the remnants of the planet's human population didn't even know who or what the gray swimmers were. What species had they evolved from? Various options were offered, from seals and dolphins to sharks and tuna, but in fact, no one knew. It was unknown even whether they had individual personalities or were a collective mind. The second assumption was hinted at by the fact that the gray swimmers always appeared only in large packs. However, the gray swimmers preferred not to make contact with humans. People learned all their new rules, usually reduced to another ban, only through punishment, when those who broke these rules disappeared or lost their minds and came to their senses only at home in one of the towers. "Do you think there is something in the statements of this new sect from the upper levels?" Tonkel asked to change the subject. "The universe is big. Anything could be in it." "I doubt it. Why would they want to contact us? We are the rapidly deteriorating remnants of a civilization that, even at its peak, could barely look beyond the atmosphere. If there's anyone to connect with now, it's the gray swimmers. But they're not going to share that information with us. So, it's probably just crazy idiots or some bloody scums trying to seize power." Chimist shielded his eyes from the sun. "Look, is it just me? Or is there a haze coming from the west?" Tonkel looked in the direction his chief mate was pointing. Indeed, a band of gray haze was spreading along the horizon, like a layer of dirty, absorbent cotton between the clear sky and the ocean. "It doesn't look like a storm front," Tonkel said. "The storm season is supposed to be over. Even yesterday's weather was an anomaly. Maybe it's the wind dying out from the west. Then the fog wouldn't surprise me." "Well, to hell with it," Chimist said with a wave of his hand. "We're heading the other way anyway. I've set a course for the Towers of Ishtar, and if there are no surprises, we'll be there in a week. Have you tried calling them?" Chimist grinned. "Why would I? You know them. They're not like our home technocracy. They've banned anything more complicated than a spinning wheel for a long time. I'm not sure that they still have transmitters in working condition. But their vegetables are way better than ours. I should give them that." By the following day, the gray fog had completely covered everything around them. Tonkel and Chimist tried everything. They lowered to the maximum height of 400 meters above the water allowed by the gray swimmers and raised the Cloud Warrior to its technical ceiling of 4 kilometers. Above this level, the anti-grav units began to malfunction, heat up, and threatened to fail. Nothing changed. The bluish, homogeneous haze didn't layer and billow as one would expect from ordinary clouds or fog. Even the feeling that the ship was moving was lost. If it weren't for the instrument readings, one would have thought the Cloud Warrior was hovering in place, though the wind kept blowing and the ship was on the move. The newcomers aboard the ship came on deck to discuss the strange phenomenon But among the sailors and even the officers, Tonkel noticed many worried faces. None of them, including even those who, like Tonkel himself, had been traveling the airspace for decades, had ever encountered anything like this before. "We'll keep to initial calculations," Tonkel said. "So far the speed was steady, and we weren't on attack, so we'll play by the chronometer." He remembered reading in a history book that once upon a time there had been many navigation satellites in orbit around the Earth, and that with simple devices, one could always determine one's position accurately. Now, it sounded like a fairy tale. Despite all the technology that allowed massive airships to travel at high altitudes, they could determine their position only by the most ancient method, by the sun and the stars. All satellites had long ago fallen into the ocean. Radar had been banned centuries ago by the gray swimmers, and even geographic landmarks remained inaccessible to humans. None of the ships that had ventured within line of sight of the forbidden continent or other land had ever made it back to their home towers. Chimest nodded. "You do realize it's the swimmers, don't you?" he asked after a while. Tonkel didn't even turn toward him. "We're still alive," he said, staring through the view screen into the gray nothingness. "Let's hope that doesn't change." The strange hypnotic journey through the gray void continued for 4 more days. The mood of the crew and passengers changed, with each day filled with uncertainty. First, anxiety was transmitted from the crew to the passengers, mostly the family members of the airmen. And then, a confused stupor spread in the same way. A steady wind pushed the cloud warrior through the haze toward its intended target, and Tonkel, Chimest, and the other navigators on watch could only guess their location. All the compasses on the ship showed nonsense, with hands dangling helplessly. But there was nothing new in that. Sometimes, it happened even in clear, bright skies when the gray swimmers performed their obscure experiments in the ocean's depths. On the 5th day, Tonkel started to worry. How would they find the towers of Ishtar when they arrived? Visibility in the haze was a maximum of a few dozen meters. From the bow of the ship, they could barely make out the aft superstructures, and the tops of the masts were almost disappearing into the fog. They could pass just a couple hundred meters past the towers and not even know it, or, on the contrary, run right into them. Tonkel was about to discuss with other navigators whether it was time to turn on the fog siren, though he doubted it would be of any use. There would be no answer from the towers of Ishtar, where the power had been in the hands of the technophobic naturalists for years, as they simply had no howlers. But something unexpected happened on the morning of the 6th day. Chimest awakened him at least an hour before Tonkel was due to wake up for his watch. "The wind is picking up," he said. "I've already ordered to do some reefing, but we'll soon be going noticeably faster than we'd expect, even with all the sails down." Tonkel understood. The hull of the airship was itself a sail, and if the wind pressure increased, the cloud warrior would pick up speed. From one side, it wasn't a big deal. The chances of colliding with another ship, or even the towers of Ishtar or some other old and already abandoned towers, were vanishingly small in the vast airspace. But what if they were swept straight into space over the forbidden continent? Sure, the haze was clearly the product of the gray swimmers, but who was to say that they were aiming specifically at Cloud Warrior? They could just be going about their incomprehensible business, and the ship and its people were in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Let's go," Tonkel said, pulling on his work coveralls. "Let's see what we can do." As soon as they reached the bridge, however, the excited voice of the forward observer came over the intercom speaker. "I see a gap." Tonkel, Chimest, and everyone on the bridge rushed to look. In the murky haze, there was indeed a large bright area directly ahead. It grew rapidly as the Cloud Warrior advanced. In its center, two tall, dark silhouettes gradually loomed high into the sky. They had found the Towers of Ishtar. Mooring to the towers in high winds was no easy task, but the Cloud Warrior crew was well seasoned and knew how to do it. After all, this wasn't a real storm. Deftly retracting all the sails, the sailors opened the bow ports with wind cannons. After adjusting course with a few pulses, Tongkol aimed for the large ramp at the 800-meter level on the North Tower, where he usually docked, and ordered the wind cannons to full power. They were wasting energy like crazy, but there was no way to slow the ship down except by creating a powerful airflow. Meanwhile, the other sailors were preparing the moorings. In calm weather, Tongkol would have moored without the help of the tower dwellers, but now it would be very difficult to pull the massive ship to the bollards without it. "There's no one there," said one of the navigators on watch suddenly. "Not a single man." Tongkol was busy with routine orders and didn't pay much attention to that. Chimus took the binoculars and looked closely at the towers. The sailors on deck froze, waiting for commands. The distance to the towers was rapidly closing, and soon Tongkol was about to open his mouth to give the last orders to moor. But Chimus lowered his binoculars and grabbed Tongkol by the arm. "Wait," he said sharply, squeezing the captain's forearm with such force that Tongkol grimaced in pain. "No, we can't go in there. Do you understand? We can't. They showed us this place. To make us realize we have to turn back. There's no one there." Only now did Tongkol finally get a better look at the towers and realize what Chimus meant. Both the towers of Ishtar, north and south, were dead. Unlike the towers of Neptune, the inhabitants here had long ago taken the path away from technology. Their reasoning, and there was a logic to it, was that it would be unavoidable sooner or later. Everything was wearing out, and there was no manufacturing capacity to replace complex devices in the towers or elsewhere. Quite quickly, the towers had turned from obelisks of the former might of a technological civilization into two vertical gardens where the cladding of entire levels had been wholly or partially dismantled. Tongkol wondered where the people of Ishtar had gotten the soil for their plantations. Could they have managed to negotiate with the gray swimmers and gain access to the ocean floor through the underwater levels? It was a forbidden area for humans for centuries. But the local inhabitants never talked about that, and he never asked. It was pretty obvious that something had happened to the people of Ishtar Towers. The towers were completely deserted. The last time the Cloud Warrior, the only ship that visited the locals, the other airmen called them barbarians and ignored them, had visited the towers of Ishtar a little less than a year ago, and whatever had happened here, it was shortly after the last visit. Some of the gardens and orchards had languished and turned into dirty brown piles of mulch that had already begun to dry up. Others, on the contrary, had burgeoned. In place of smooth beds and rows of small fruit trees, lush green thickets burst to life, and not a single human anywhere. "No bodies either," said someone behind Tongkol's back. It was true. If the towers of Ishtar population had been struck by some unknown deadly disease or some mysterious weapon of the gray swimmers, though no one knew if they even had anything that could be called a weapon, there would surely be at least a few bodies visible somewhere. Many locals lived among their plantations and used the remaining rooms in the towers only to store their crops. But there were none. The entire crew and passengers piled onto the deck and silently surveyed the deserted towers as the Cloud Warrior sailed past in near total silence. The gray mist that obscured the horizon amplified the surreal impression, as if this were not reality, but some incredibly believable stereo movie. Suddenly, There was a movement among those lined up on deck along the rail. People were talking and pointing downward. Tonkal looked down through the slanted glass of the bridge and shuddered. The gray haze had disappeared all the way down to the surface of the water, but it wasn't the usual ripples of the ocean. As far as the eye could see, the water was boiling with an enormous herd of gray swimmers. Their dark, powerful backs flickered near the surface, lining, as they always did, into incomprehensible fractal patterns that moved and flowed into each other. This hypnotic pattern went to the edges of the gray haze, but Tonkal felt that the gray swimmers' game extended beyond that, way beyond. Do you think it's their fault?" Chimest asked. Tonkal only shook his head in silence. Guessing was useless. There was no way to find out. As always. As the Cloud Warrior sailed slowly past the ramp to which it had initially been headed, none of the sailors standing at the mooring lines moved. It wasn't even the lack of commands from the bridge, or the fact that no one would receive the throwing ends. The men realized without a word that the towers of Ishtar no longer belonged to mankind. Above the gaping, open, dark maw of the gate to the North Tower, the gate leaves had long ago been removed by the locals. Tonkal suddenly noticed something that had not been there before. He reached for binoculars and, bumping into Chimest's hand, realized that he had seen it too. Above the dark opening, a few words were written in large, gnarled letters. "Wait for Caravan." A moment later, the ship moved farther away, and the inscription was obscured by the massive silhouette of the South Tower. The ocean far below continued to churn with the mysterious dancing of the planet's current masters. The wind began to pick up again. After a week and a half, the Cloud Warrior emerged from the haze, and Chimest finally managed to take a few stars and determine the ship's position. The results stunned everyone. It appeared that the ship, caught in a strange wind, had made a giant loop and had flown over a large chunk of the Forbidden Continent. Now, they were almost on a reverse course and would return to the starting point of their journey, the towers of Neptune, in a few days. At least, that was the way it appeared, given the ship's current course, which was coming straight out of the Forbidden Continent. The most intriguing thing was that the crew had made no attempt to change course while drifting through the gray nothingness. Tonkal saw no point in it because, at that moment, they all assumed that the ship was being carried into the vast width of the ocean somewhere in the direction of the North Pole, which was still many thousands of kilometers away. This was undoubtedly the result of the gray swimmers' activity. The picture of the living ocean near the deserted Ishtar Towers was still vivid in everyone's memory. Tonkal and Chimest decided to tell the crew everything, leaving out, however, the mention of the flight over the Forbidden Continent. The navigators, too, had to keep their mouths shut. Tonkal totally trusted them on that. Everyone understood that it was not worth disturbing the already confused people. Another day later, the Neptune Towers made contact for the first time. "Just a teletype message," Chimest said, holding a piece of paper to Tonkal. "Apart from it, it's total silence. I don't think it was addressed to us specifically, but rather, we caught a random internal transmission. If you want to know my opinion, I think they've all gone completely insane over there." According to the latest transmission, by-elections for the Emergency Committee and Lottery Commission will be held within the next 10 days. All Caravan seats obtained by citizens in the first draw remain assigned to the winners. The arrival date will be known after the next transmission from the Algol Empire. Tonkal reread the text several times. What is this nonsense? What council? What lottery? What the hell is this empire? Maybe it's just some kids playing around? On the official government bulletin frequency? Chimest shrugged. Nothing would surprise me now, though. Most importantly, did you pay attention to the date? June 28th. Why? As it should be. Chimest sighed. Look at the year. Tonkel looked, and stood there, with his mouth open. The gray swimmers, he finally said. The mist. I thought the towers of Ishtar looked a little too run down even for 10 months of neglect, Chimest said softly. 3 years. What have they done to us? Tonkel released the paper from his fingers, and it slid under the table with a quiet rustle, easily and imperceptibly, just as the gray swimmers had stolen 3 years from them. 5 days later, they, for the first time, saw on the horizon the 2 thin needles of the distant towers of Neptune. In the meantime, they received several more radiograms from there, all transmitted in teletype mode, with no voice transmissions. It was understandable. For the towers, the ship has been lost for 3 years, and no one there would ever think of trying to contact the long-dead airmen, especially since, judging by the radiograms, the towers were living some strange and enigmatic life of their own, connected with the mysterious Algol Empire. The memories of the cult of crazy contactors from the upper levels were quickly coming to mind, but neither Tonkel, nor Chimest, nor any sane person could take this nonsense seriously. However, the meaning of the radiograms was all settled into its own strange logic. A by-election, a transmission from the Algol Empire, whatever it was, about increasing the number of places in the first caravan, a new lottery drawing. At least there was no war there, as Tonkel feared. I just remembered we haven't caught a single ton of krill, Chimest said. I've done the math. We must have crossed at least 6 permanent migration routes, but haven't seen a single herd. Tonkel couldn't hold back a smile. We've lost 3 whole years somewhere. We're going back to either a fantasy novel or a madhouse, and you're worried about the catch? Chimest shook his head. You know, I can't help feeling that this was our last voyage, that the gray swimmers didn't put on this show for us, for nothing. Something tells me they've decided to stop flying sceners over their heads. You may be right, but I'm less concerned with that now than with what's waiting for us back home. Tonkel pointed to the Neptune Towers, which were less than 2 hours away now. On deck, there was a somewhat confused excitement among the crew and passengers. Everyone was already aware of the strange chain of events, and the dominant emotion on the ship was an odd mixture of amusement and bewilderment. At least the swimmers aren't interfering anymore, Chimest said. In all the time since they'd emerged from the haze, they hadn't seen a single swimmer in the vicinity of the ship, just a few suspicious areas far out on the horizon. The wind is great. If nothing changes, we might even be able to dock without Tower's help, in case anything happens. Tonkel cast a quick glance at Friend. The sight of the derelict dead Ishtar Towers was still fresh in his mind. And then it hit him. Shit, he exclaimed. Why didn't we realize it before? The inscription on the Ishtar. Chimest stared at him. Wait for the caravan, he said. No one has seen it but you and me, and I was beginning to think I was imagining it. The Caravan. Tonkel felt as if he had fallen into another world, a world with rules he had no idea of, but which he had to reckon with, figuring them out on the go. What had the gray swimmers done to them? Or were there other forces at work here, even more powerful ones? The towers were getting closer. Preparing for mooring distracted Tonkel a little from his troubling thoughts, the calming effect of familiar work. Against his expectations, the ship was spotted from the tower, and people appeared on the mooring ramp. As the Cloud Warrior approached, Tonkel even thought he recognized some people ready to take moorings. However, he was met at the ramp by a complete stranger. My name is Atrigain, the man introduced, shaking Tonkal's hand. "I am a representative of the Emergency Committee and an inspector of the Lottery Control Board. I'm glad to see you. Though honestly, I didn't expect you. Your ship has been missing for a long time. How did you manage to return? I hope the fact that you violated the Gray Swimmer's flight ban will not affect the tower." Tonkal introduced himself. "So it is a ban after all," he said. "We suspected something like that." "Yes," Atragain nodded. "Since the swimmers returned the empty, unmanned Fatalo ship to us a year ago, only one ship has attempted to launch. We lost contact with it after 24 hours, and we never saw it again." "We saw the Towers of Ishtar," Tonkal said. Atragain nodded. "Yes, we are aware of what happened there." Tonkal stared at him, perplexed. How? Had the Ishtar suddenly started using radios, and the Gray Swimmers started allowing radio signals to get through? Or did the swimmers decide to scare you by telling you they'd done away with the gardeners? Atragain shook his head. No, why would they? The swimmers had nothing to do with it, and there's nothing wrong with the gardeners. They were taken by a scout ship from Algol, the one that first discovered our planet and negotiated with the swimmers to back off a bit. It was in one of the first official transmissions from the Algol Empire. I guess it didn't reach you. By the way, where have you been for 3 years? We're at a loss as to why the Gray Swimmers released you. Tonkal tried his best to keep a calm demeanor, though he was convinced he was talking to a madman. A scout ship? Transmissions? The Algol Empire? Atragain smiled broadly, and no matter how hard Tonkal tried to detect signs of madness on his face, it was just the friendly smile of an average person. Well, yes. They had agreed to gradually evacuate the humans from Earth to a more habitable planet. In fact, their first caravan would begin picking up the lottery winners today. A huge shadow suddenly fell over them, covering them both, the entire ramp, the massive hull of the Cloud Warrior moored to it, and even part of the tower. There they are, Atragain said with admiration and hope, and pointed upward. The first jumper is already here. A vast, strange silhouette, like a tangle of giant spheres, prisms, and polyhedrons, hovered over them, obscuring a good third of the sky. In some places, the blue of the sky and the white clouds still shone through it, but it quickly darkened and became opaque, solidifying in its unshakable reality. After a few minutes, dark holes opened in it, and a host of similarly geometric, smaller apparatuses slid out of it. Tonkal watched with his mouth open as the machines flew toward the tower. At the same time, several more sparkling giants appeared in the sky, one after another, like the suddenly sprouted fruit of an invisible tree. The first caravan from the Algol Empire arrived. As the hurricane season drew to a close, and the fierce storms that had shaken the South Tower to its very foundations moved off toward the pole, passing the baton to calm monsoon winds that blew evenly and steadily, Shirana pulled out her father's ragged storm jacket from the locker and started to go to the outer ramp 2 or 3 times a week. There, she built a small observation cabin out of sheets of transparent polyplastic and pieces of steel tubing, where she sat for hours, sipping hot coffee from a thermos and looking out at the 2 vast oceans merging somewhere on the horizon, the sky and the water. She had purposely built her sanctuary away from the North Tower, the long, dilapidated finger of civilization jutting into the tired sky, mottled with a bizarre pattern of rusty stains, the ribs of wharf and walkway ramps, and the glow of the polyplastic cladding of the greenhouses. Sharana liked to see the grayish-blue surface of the ocean, on which the sun's rays painted a fanciful baroque gold ligature. The ramp was on the 613th floor, more than a mile above sea level. But even from that height, the shore of the forbidden continent could not be seen. The huge swarms of gray swimmers that often patrolled the vicinity of the Neptune Towers looked only like light ripples on the water's surface, a ghostly flicker of living, moving shadows beneath the waves. Her father had told her that once, thousands of years ago, things had been different. People had lived on continents, and their cities had grown not upward, but outward. For there was more than enough space on land, and there were millions, hundreds of millions, billions of them. Sharana believed her father, not as one believes in the morning news, but as children believe in bedtime stories. Long ago, in a distant kingdom, people lived happily without troubles or worries. She even told her father so, but he only laughed and said that if it were true, things wouldn't have ended with the gray swimmers and the gradually emptying towers. Unlike the almost wholly deserted North Tower, quite a few people still lived in the South Tower. 20,000, maybe a bit more. It wasn't many for a giant structure designed for millions. Most of them huddled a few floors above the 600th, though the majority of the other 1,500 floors could be housed too if only people had the strength and will to move there. But the inhabitants of the South Tower instinctively huddled together like animals in the middle of the cold Arctic tundra against the piercing winds. Even radical individualists like Sharana dwelled at most 5 or 6 floors away from the relatively densely populated areas, though there was no practical need to stay close. The tower's automation disabled most uninhabited floors, and the council had imposed a fee for reconnecting living areas to the energy grid, but it wasn't hard to do. But there was an elusive, ancient instinct that tens of thousands of years ago had forced distant ancestors to huddle as closely as possible around the fire that separated safety from the predator-filled darkness of night. This instinct was still bounding people together, stronger than monomolecular fibers. Sharana took a couple more sips of coffee, watching the almost imperceptible movement of a whole bunch of silvery, puffy clouds in the eastern part of the sky, already slightly tinged with evening purple. Sharana was mesmerized by this movement on the edge of reality, but the observations also had a practical meaning. The movement of the eastern periwinkle front meant that the migration of air krill would reach the tower in a few days, and it was time to stretch the trapping nets. The krill fishing was not a necessity for the tower's inhabitants. Bioreactors and hydroponic robotic farms provided them with enough food. This tradition was rooted in ancient times, before contact with the Algol Empire, evacuation caravans, and the lottery. Once, during an expedition to the upper tiers, Sharana had found a memory crystal of environmentalist reports in one of the archive vaults. It was on the 900th floor, one of the former university centers of the South Tower. The records were partially damaged, and the language had changed a lot in the few hundred years since the university levels had closed. But Sharana managed to understand the central part of the records. Long ago, the towers, counted by hundreds, reached the point where they could not provide food for the growing population, and air krill had been bred artificially as one of the measures to provide food. Apparently, even then, the gray swimmers did not allow the tower dwellers to take advantage of what the ocean could provide. The reddish disk of the sun was already catching on the distant smoky horizon, and Sharana shivered. Of course, it wasn't an actual evening breeze, for the tower couldn't be called an actual landmass. The abandoned dock ramp extended far above the dizzying abyss, the bottom of which was the shimmering gold of the evening ocean. This gave Sharana a nearly circular view, but it also left her open to any air currents, which became noticeably colder by nightfall and sucked the day's warmth out of the girl's polyplastic hut. It was time to go back. Carmine was waiting for her at the elevator entrance. Sharana was surprised. Unlike her, Carmine disliked the desolate atmosphere of the upper floors, preferring the constant hum of the densely populated neighborhoods. Sharana lived on the 612th floor, with only a few dozen people as neighbors. But there he was, sitting on the pipelines, his head tucked into his shoulders. Carmine has told Sharana more than once that the empty floors seem like old tombs to him, inhabited by the ghosts of people who once inhabited them. At the sight of Sharana, Carmine instantly jumped up and almost ran up to her. They hugged. Then Sharana pulled away and looked her friend in the face. "Hello," she said. "I didn't expect to see you here." Carmine shrugged wryly, as if he was struggling to keep from looking away. "I missed you," he said. "You haven't been down at our floor in almost a month. And anyway..." He stopped talking. Sharana squinted at him. "Spit it out," she demanded. "I can see you're in a tizzy about something." Did the council bring up the question of forced relocation again? Carmine waved his hand languidly. "Yes, they talk about it at every session. But you know..." He shook his head. "It's just the rambling of self-righteous fools. The truth is, they realize they don't have enough power to carry out such plans." He laughed. "Hell, they can't even re-elect the head of the Control Commission, and they only get to the upper tiers matters when they're exhausted from the endless intrigue and bickering." Sharana nodded to him, and they walked down the wide tunnel, illuminated by the soft bluish light of the luminescent mushrooms. Carmine walked in silence for a while. Sharana did not hurry him. She knew her friend's character well. He always took a long time to gather his thoughts before he said something important. But there was no stopping him once he started. "The lottery will be held 2 months earlier this year," Carmine said at last. "The council announced the commission's decision 2 days ago." He squinted and looked at Sharana. That information went live on the broadcast right after the official announcement. Sharana shook her head. "I don't listen to the broadcasts," she said. "And why that doesn't surprise me." Carmine shrugged. "The council's political squabbles bore me," Sharana said. "I didn't settle a few tiers away from the center to have my brains polluted by their pointless fuss." "What about the lottery commission reports and the transmissions from Algol?" Carmine asked. Sharana answered nothing, continuing to pace. Every now and then, she absent-mindedly reached out to the wall and ran her fingers over the fungus, causing it to eject spores, small sheaves of blue sparks that slowly settled on the metal plastic floor. "Rumor has it that the Caravan will be larger than usual this year," Carmine said. "They say the commission is deciding whether to expand the list of winners or hold an additional drawing." "Does it matter?" Sharana asked without turning around. "How would I know?" Carmine was silent for a moment. "I'm just an ordinary citizen concerned about what's happening in the tower. But there's a persistent rumor that something huge is brewing, something that will change everything once and for all." Sharana stopped and put her palm on the sensor panel. The rectangular door slid aside with a slight hiss, revealing a vestibule illuminated by a warm yellowish light. "The krill migration is about to begin," Sharana said, standing in the doorway half-turned toward Carmine. "Would you stay a few days and help me set up the nets?" She smiled as she turned on the kitchen light and heard Carmine's footsteps behind her. She didn't really doubt him. Sharana hit the rubber mallet, and the base of the support console clicked into place and the lock welded to the deck of the air dock. Sharana brushed her bangs back from her sweaty forehead and pressed the start button. The servo motor whirred, releasing telescoping cranks with a round radar-like plaque. Carmine did the same thing 15 meters up on the control bridge. It was as if a giant metal snail were releasing its eye stalks horizontally, linked together by a light glittering web. "Come down," shouted Sharana to Carmine, who was leaning over the leer, watching the movement of the consoles. "That's enough for today." A gust of wind carried her words away, but Carmine guessed their meaning from her gestures and nodded. The way down to the main deck was either an elevator shaft at the rear of the bridge, connected to the tower's main wall, or an open-work spiral staircase that went straight down from the fire hatch in the floor. But Carmine chose a third way. He snapped 2 ropes into carabiners, threaded into massive brackets on the bridge parapet, dropped the loose ends down so that the locking knots fell to the deck, then secured the safety and rappelling devices on his harness to the ropes and dashed down the ropes to where Sharana grinned and waited for him. "Daredevil," she commented. "A daredevil and a poser." Carmine nodded, unbuckling his gear from the ropes. "There's a bit of that," he said, "but that's more out of boredom. When you live in a densely populated place where everything's scheduled and planned, the abundance of rules can get on your nerves." He unbuckled the harness, then picked a slack in the ropes and tied them to a bracket on the deck. "You could move here," Sharana said, watching the scattering of pearly sunlight shimmering in the nets between the support cantilevers. "I mean, there's plenty of apartments in decent condition. You'd get a severance package if you quit the control commission, right? Plus, the profits from the catch. That should add up to 10,000 energy units, no less, enough for power restoration until next season. Or..." She stopped talking, realizing Carmine already knew what she meant. Or he could move in with her. Carmine shook his head. "I can't. You must understand. People are buzzing. The new lottery deadline, the possible expansion of the lists, the extra draw. Something is changing, or about to change, something that will affect us all. And don't forget that the gray swimmers' activity is increasing daily. They also sense something or are waiting for something. I can't quit my job. I just can't right now." Everyone's waiting for something, Sharana thought. But who am I kidding? I know exactly what it's going to be. "A transmission from the Empire," she said. Carmine nodded. "Yes, the Council is expecting it next week. Rumors are that it will be a test transmission before the Caravan arrives, dates, capacity, that sort of stuff." Sharana knew. Next week, Algol will announce how many people can finally get off this planet. And then the Council would announce a lottery to find out who the lucky ones would be. "Let's go home," Sharana said. "I've got a couple bottles of wine there from level 710. Carmine, grinning, shook his head. "You never cease to amaze me, sure. 2 bottles from level 710th. Do you know how much they could be worth? Sometimes I wonder why you go to all this trouble to catch krill when you can just haul some stuff from the upper levels." Sharana put the tools in the case, closed the lid, and wiped her sweaty face. Carmine was smiling, looking at her. "I don't know," Sharana said. "I guess I just like the sun and the wind. They make me feel fresh, alive." She sighed, looking out at the ocean in the golden flames of the pre-sunset sun. "Have you ever been above the 700th floor?" "No, of course not." Carmine shook his head as they headed for the hangar gate. "I've never been above 670. Somehow, I feel more at ease closer to civilized places." Sharana laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "You don't have to tell me. I'm not the council or the commission. You were just telling me you were dreaming about getting away from there. Admit it. The truth is you can't live without elevators." "You got me. I give up." Carmine laughed too. "It's too much for my fat, bureaucratic ass to climb a few thousand stairs for 2 or 3 bottles of wine or an antique teapot that I have to carry back. I'd rather keep moving papers around in my office while you bring the vintage goods for us to drink together." Sharana nodded her head with contrived seriousness. "It's a deal. But next time, I'll demand a written confession from you. in large block letters, "I'm a lazy bum," and a signature. You can even put the seal of the commission on it. They laughed and joked all the way down to the interlevel elevator and then 2 floors below, all the way to the door of Sharana's apartment. As Sharana secretly hoped, though she would never have dared ask for it out loud, Carmine not only helped her finish the traps, but also stayed for the migration of the air krill, which began a day after they had stretched the last net. The krill herds were nowhere near as numerous and dense as they had been in the past, and Sharana could handle the traps alone. But for the 2 of them, the task became more like a game, especially since the weather was fine. The genius geneticists of the past had hardwired into the DNA strands of the air krill the migration routes bound to wind around the towers of Neptune. All that was needed was to stretch out large magnetic traps with receiving chutes underneath. The krill's large, translucent, pearlescent gas sacs would relax when they hit the trap's magnetic field, release hydrogen, and the sickle-shaped, plump krill carcasses would roll down the netting and into the chutes, directing them straight into crates, which Sharana and Carmine would then roll on a cart into the freezer. Once, the krill herds had been giant living currents, mighty quivering rivers many miles wide, and large airships had gone out to hunt for them. For back then, the lives of the tower dwellers had depended on the catch. Sharana came from a line of hereditary fishermen who had worked on such a vessel. But then, the gray swimmers stopped liking it, and then the first caravan from the Algol Empire appeared, and the need for mass fishing was eliminated. From a vital product, krill became a table decoration, almost a luxury food that allowed people to brighten up their monotonous lives from caravan to caravan, from lottery to lottery. For Sharana, however, krill was a way of providing a life above the main levels. The council, ever obsessed with densification, had ordered 15 years ago that all levels above 610th be cut off from power, blaming it on a shortage of maintenance personnel. It was a lie. The tower's power system, modernized by engineers from Algol, ran smoothly without any maintenance. But the council was the only authority in the tower, and it was useless to argue with it. The council, however, not wanting to conflict with eccentric citizens, left a loophole for weirdos like Sharana. You could still connect your home to the power grid by paying the council a hefty sum of money in estimated energy units. But you had to earn them somehow, and doing it outside the populated levels took a lot of work. Krill fishing. Migrations occurred 6 times a year, and occasional trips to distant upper floors for antique curiosities helped. However, Sharana realized that all this would soon come to an end. With each caravan, the population of the tower was inexorably dwindling. It was not long before it, like its northern sister, would finally become an abandoned monument to a humanity that had become a stranger on its own planet. Everyone felt this, and therefore, the demand for antiques was falling rapidly, and the council's primary task became the development of programs to combat depression and apathy between caravans. Only the lottery drawings that took place before the arrival of each caravan somehow revitalized the atmosphere of indifference that reigned in the tower. Sharana was caressing the illusion that it didn't affect her. However, deep down, she knew she was still part of the same expectation-ridden enclave as everyone else, except she handled it a little easier. As if punishing herself for this perceived weakness, she regularly turned off the stereo broadcast of the council's central news channel. She ignored email notifications, blocking even the ability to read their headlines. It was like how a person tired of household chores stubbornly refuses to open envelopes with bills, even though he realizes that sooner or later he'll have to look through and pay them anyway. Carmine returned to his 602nd just after the migration ended, and they dismantled the traps. The nets couldn't be left out for long. They were designed for the light winds that carried the krill swarms smoothly, but even a small storm would almost certainly break them and throw them away from the tower. 2 weeks had passed since then. Shirana had spent this time inspecting and making minor repairs to the traps, reading ancient books, and fiddling with documentary archive videos. She'd brought back a whole bunch of memory crystals from one of her trips to the university floors, and now she was trying to adapt a modern reader to work with them, but the protocols were too different. One of the tech center's programmers would probably have no problem with such a task, but Shirana did not intend to let anyone else in on her hobby, not even Carmine. She still came to the air dock in the evenings. The weather was mostly fine, and she no longer hid from the winds in her cabin, but simply sat on the deck, leaned against the wall, and admired the sunset, which colored the sky in various shades of pink, turning to purple as the night progressed, and the blue-gold mirror of the ocean, which occasionally showed the geometrically regular ripples of the gray swimmer's movements. Everything changed when Carmine came to her outside ramp one evening. Until now, he'd kept his unspoken agreement never to disturb her meditation evenings. However, as soon as she saw him, Shirana knew something serious had happened. The irritation that had begun to rise was instantly replaced by anxious forebodings. "Shir, did you get the letter with the lottery results?" Carmine asked without even saying hello, which was an additional harbinger of important news. "The system shows it was sent 5 days ago, but it's never been viewed, and you're not responding to control requests." Shirana shook her head. "I'm afraid I've lost interest in the news lately," she said slowly. Carmine stared at her incredulously. "So you're saying you got the letter, but didn't bother to check what's in it?" Shirana shrugged. "Why should I? I can guess what's in it. I've never had much luck with gambling. Why would the trend change?" "You're wrong this time," Carmine said. "You really should have opened the letter." This time, Shirana gave him an incredulous look in her turn. The secrecy of the draw results was protected by a special law. No one could know the winners' names unless they announced them themselves. The commission only provided the total number of lottery winners not earlier than 2 weeks after the drawing. When they could be sure, everyone had already discovered their fate. "You've developed psychic powers?" Shirana asked with a touch of sneer in her voice. "Or are you just trying to cheer me up this primitive way?" Carmine remained silent, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Obviously, he was bursting with news, but he couldn't decide where to begin. "He's not kidding," Shirana thought suddenly. "He's dead serious." And very excited. "Wait, are you serious?" she asked in a lower tone, trying frantically to comprehend what was happening. "I won, but how did you—" Carmine waved his hand with the kind of expression with which an unlucky gambler suddenly and decisively moves all his remaining chips to the 00. "Actually, I'm not supposed to talk about it," he said. "Hell, I'm not even supposed to know about it." He rubbed his forehead, pulling himself together. "Shirana, this time, everyone wins." Shirana's gaze went from incredulous to incomprehension. "What do you mean, everyone?" Carmine spread his hands. "That's right, all of them. I know people on the council, you know, the ones who have their fingers on the pulse. One of them said they decided to do it that way, to not alarm the people beforehand. A lot of people don't like to talk about their draw results. But this much is certain. There was no actual draw, just a mailing with notices of the winnings." Shirana tried to make sense of what she'd just heard. "I'm sorry. I guess I'm really behind the curve here. There was already a transmission from Algol, wasn't there?" Carmine nodded. "Yes, and it said the Caravan would be the last. The Algolians said the navigators predicted massive changes in hyperspace currents, making navigation to Earth nearly impossible for the next 200 years. So they diverted additional ships here, and they'd take everyone. They said it's a complicated and expensive operation for them, but their contract with the Gray Swimmers requires them to take everyone out in the next 50 years, so they just can't wait for things to calm down in hyperspace. The Council decided not to release this information just yet. They just announced an extended circulation. Christ, sure, we're finally going to fly out of here. Sharana was silent for a moment. And when will the Caravan arrive? She finally asked. The first ships will be here in 11 days, Carmine replied. And then they'll keep coming for another week. You'll have time to pack. And you? Carmine shook his head guiltily. I have work to do. You have no idea what's going on in the Council and all the governing bodies. Of course, no one knows the true state of affairs except the close inner circle. But some people have already made their winnings public. It's a total mess and will get worse. And we have to live these remaining days somehow. I've had a hard time getting to you, and I'm sure they're already looking for me. So, as sorry as I am, I have to run. Sharana forced herself to smile. Of course you do. Everyone should do what is needed. Your job is more important than ever. You've been chosen as the boarding coordinator for the 603rd floor, right? Carmine nodded, starting to back away from the ramp. Yeah, I've got a lot on my plate. Of course, the protocols are well established, but the scale of this is unprecedented. He paused, looking fondly into Sharana's eyes. Sure, I'll understand if you want to leave on the first transport, but I'd really like you to wait for me. Of course, Sharana said without averting her gaze. I'll be sure to wait for you. One evening, Sharana caught the arrival of the first ship from the Algol Empire. As on previous occasions, the gigantic vessel did not descend from the sky, from outside the Earth's atmosphere, as one would expect a typical traditional spaceship to do. Instead, it materialized out of thin air about a click away from the South Tower. A massive pile of sparkling iridescent polygons and hemispheres that hovered in one place in defiance of all the laws of physics. Sharana was about to leave at that moment, but she lingered to admire the ship. The Algol jumpers had always fascinated her. A quiet power that didn't need to prove itself to others. The whole Algol Empire was like that. The Empire was evacuating the remnants of humanity, purely for reasons of charity. A pitiful handful of humans simply could not be of interest, economic or otherwise, to a vast empire that had spread its power or influence over thousands of star systems. The Algolians made an agreement with the Gray Swimmers, whose relations with humans had been getting worse year by year. They found a suitable planet for humans and gradually transported them there, leading caravans through the solar system at every convenient turn of the hyperspace currents. The stranded humans suddenly found a path to salvation. The iridescence illuminated the surface of the jumper for about 15 minutes, then faded away, and the ship turned from a precious crystal cluster into a giant tuberous body with unexpectedly regular geometric growths on its surface. Before Sharana's eyes, several hemispheres separated from the jumper and glided smoothly toward the tower, heading for the residential floor's air ramps below Sharana's observation post. The Algolians didn't like to waste time. The first batches of evacuees would be aboard the jumper no later than midnight. 2 more jumper ships arrived the next day, followed by 3 more before the end of the week. The ships were too big to moor directly to the tower, so they hovered further out and sent transport shuttles to pick up the people. Sharana watched them scurry back and forth, casting round shadows on the golden blue surface of the ocean like some huge mechanical insects gathering pollen from the tower's giant metal flower. A pair of hemispheres even went to the North Tower. Apparently, there were still people in it who, for some reason, had not wanted to move to the South Tower in due course. A few more days passed. Sharana made an almost conscious effort not to count them down, and the activity of the transports decreased noticeably. Then, one by one, the jumpers began to depart. They switched back on their iridescent illumination, a stasis field that protected the ships from the effects of hyperspace disturbances, and then slowly disappeared, vanishing into thin air with the same surreal speed and grace with which they had appeared. Eventually, the last ship was left. It began to shimmer, but suddenly it went quiet. A small hemisphere separated from it and flew toward the ramp where Sharana's observation post was located. As the hemisphere flew toward her, the girl got up from her chair and retreated into the dense shadows near the entrance gate, from which a service corridor ran deep into the tower, dimly lit only by luminescent fungi. The hemisphere slowed and lowered itself gently onto the corrugated metal of the deck. A hatch opened in its side, and Carmine jumped out, looking around. "Sure," he called out. "Please, sure. I know you can hear me." Sharana watched in silence as he looked around, as his eyes, full of tears, gradually showed understanding, tinged with black shades of despair. "Sure, please." The ship only had a few minutes left to launch. It couldn't wait any longer. I barely talked the captain into giving me a chance to pick you up. Carmine took a few steps towards the gate, and Sharana retreated further into the depths of the corridor before turning and running without looking back. Carmine's pleading cries could barely reach her through the pounding of soles on the floor, and then they were gone. When she reached her apartment and looked out the window, she saw only the last sparks of the disappearing jumper. It was gone in a moment, and then all that was left was the blue sky with occasional strokes of whitish clouds and the monotonous ripples of the ocean.